Foxhole is in the middle of one of its deadliest wars in history. We are only 16 days into War 132, and both sides have combined for over 4 million deaths. To put that into perspective, Foxhole's deadliest war took 69 days to get over 8 million deaths. At this rate, War 132 is on pace to break 10 million by war's end, something never before seen in the game's history. You see, Foxhole's wars go in waves. The game has a solid player base for its niche, but during large update wars like Entrenched, Inferno, or Naval Warfare, the player base explodes, with both new players and veterans alike jumping in to go try hard, no life, and all out sweat this update war in order to cement their legacy in Foxhole's history. Foxhole's most recent update, Airborne, and the update War 132, is no different, with an all-time peak player count for the game of 17,000 players on day one. But yesterday, something happened. The war stood still. Both factions came together, set up campfires, joked, and told stories, all because of this. A crane. On day 15 of War 132, Wardens began mass-producing cranes and driving them down to the border between Weathered Expanse and the Claustra. Along this border, they lined up hundreds of these cranes, 3 cranes deep, to create a massive crane wall. As word got out, more players began helping build this crane wall, and even colonial players braved enemy territory to sneak their own cranes in to add to the wall. For over an hour, these mortal enemies simply talked, laughed, joked with one another, and enjoyed each other's company until the truce eventually ended in true Foxhole fashion. But why? What could possibly drive a player base, which typically rage baits and insults each other 24/7, to come together over a crane wall? Well, on day 15 of War 132, the developers of Foxhole pushed an update that prevented players from entering enemy cranes. Cranes are one of the most useful vehicles in the game and are used for pretty much everything, from deploying artillery to loading raw material to shipping logistics. These vehicles are the backbone of all types of operations, and like most vehicles in Foxhole, if you take the initiative to find one and steal it, well, it's yours. Foxhole is a sandbox. It's a 24/7 persistent war game where the devs give you an empty map and say, hey, why don't you guys just figure out how to kill each other and we'll see you when it ends. And being able to commandeer vehicles, steal equipment from the backlines, and generally sabotage the other team is a critical part of this ecosystem. Some vehicles, however, have been restricted over the years for gameplay purposes, most notably the construction vehicle, or CV, which is used to build bases. Stealing CVs made it far too easy for players to simply purchase a different version of the game, log on as the opposite faction, drive the CV to somewhere secret, then log back onto their main account, and then just build up a secret base. Large ships like frigates or destroyers are also restricted due to the sheer amount of time and energy that goes into making them. But almost everything else in game can be stolen. See a truck, grab it. Find a parking lot of abandoned APCs, grab your wrench, and thank you very much. One of the most infamous super heavy tanks in Foxhole wasn't even owned by the faction that could produce it. In War 96, the Colonials captured a Warden Cullen Predator, and through various battles, it quickly became known as the Beast of the East. For Colonials, it would rally the troops around them, and for Wardens, they would start throwing everything at this to try and finally slay the Beast. There was also Athena, a Colonial super heavy tank that was still in production when the Wardens captured the facility. After the Colonials had been pushed out, Wardens simply protected the base until the production run was finished, and then used Athena in multiple battles on their way to win War 102. Stealing vehicles is not uncommon in Foxhole, but the average player will more commonly find themselves on a front line that overruns a position only to find that the enemy abandoned trucks, flatbeds, fuel tankers, and cranes. This quick capturing of equipment can greatly improve gameplay and allow both sides the ability to set up defenses or simply resupply their lines immediately. Battles with artillery commonly result in one side quickly collapsing, falling back with anything that they could save, and then the other side advancing to that old enemy position, immediately taking advantage of the abandoned equipment and continuing on with their operation. Cranes are one of the most useful tools on the battlefield, but they can only be built at towns or relic bases, meaning that oftentimes players out in the front line will opt not to kill enemy cranes because of how useful they are. Destroying a crane means that someone has to go back to one of those bases, spend 2 minutes and 125 BMATs building them, find fuel for it, and then slowly drive it back out to the front. It's a very long process. Cranes are cheap, but getting them back to the front can be a very long process, so keeping these things alive and in the fight is a huge force multiplier. And we haven't even talked about one of the ways a small section of the community uses cranes to shape entire wars. Tap ops. To tap in Foxhole means to reset a base to its lowest level of technology. A tier 3 town, for example, will have access to defensive structures like garrison houses and safe houses. You'll have industrial buildings like refineries or seaports, and the town base itself is stronger and more resilient to enemy damage. If you destroy an enemy base that is tier 3 and you build it up for your own team, you now have that same town, but it starts at tier 1. Every time bases switch hands in Foxhole, you start back at square one, and it could take days for those technologies to progress back up to a fully defended town, creating a nice tug of war over contested regions and encouraging players to have more active defenses while everything gets built back up. A tap-op aims to not hold a town or relic base permanently, but instead to blow apart the town, build it up for themselves, and then reset all the tech so it's back at tier 1. Players will then destroy all the useful buildings around it as well, so when the enemy finally takes it back, they're left with a very weak and far less useful town to operate from. In this war, War 132, the colonial tier 3 town of Jade Cove was tapped, and because of the tap, the entire north side of the region soon collapsed, opening up a new front for the Wardens. But in order to accomplish this operation, however, a partisan player by the name of Squid spent hours scouting ahead and storing a crane on the west side of the town. When the time came for the operation, they shipped a freighter full of construction vehicles up to this cliff, they craned the vehicles into the city, blew up the town hall, and then built it up with all of those CVs just a minute later. With one small change to who can get into a crane, partisan operations deep into enemy territory have effectively been killed. So, if these vehicles are so useful, both on the front line as well as in partisan ops, then why, after 7 years of being in the game, have the developers decided to finally restrict players from entering enemy cranes? The answer? Sabotage. Yes, the same gameplay mechanic the developers have encouraged for the entire lifespan of the game is now considered bad. And here's why. So, in order to make the strongest vehicles in Foxhole, you have to build a facility. Player-built facilities are massive, player-made industrial cities that require daily upkeep and defenses. But once these vehicles are made, you just have to leave them out in the middle of your base. You can't store them anywhere. Typically, storage depots or seaports are used for storing not just raw material and frontline equipment, but also vehicles. When stored, players don't have to worry about their expensive toys being damaged or stolen by enemies or even friendlies when they aren't using them. But certain facility-made vehicles, like battle tanks and super heavy tanks, cannot be stored in these depots. Players quickly learn that the best way to protect them would be to package them at their facility and then store them on a crane, typically one of these stationary cranes, and then lock that crane to their own squad so other friendly players wouldn't be able to steal it. Enemy partisans could still find their way into the base and destroy the crane if they really wanted to, but that's the nature of all-out war, right? A well-designed base would be able to protect most things most of the time, so this crane storage option kind of worked. Kind of. But players were not happy. It didn't make sense to spend days maintaining bases just to produce one vehicle, and for that one vehicle not being able to be protected like literally everything else in Foxhole. Many people suggested player-made depots or storage hangars, understanding that the devs didn't want these high-cost vehicles in regular storage depots or seaports, but still wanting a way to protect them when they weren't being used. If we're already spending all these resources to build and maintain this massive facility, it's not that big of a deal to add in a hangar that we have to build and maintain too. However, the players' wishes would go unanswered. For years, cranes were now the de facto facility vehicle storage method. It was not a good solution, but it's what the players had. Well, until planes were added to the game. 15 days into the Airborne update, the devs finally agreed that crane locking extremely expensive vehicles was not a good solution, but their fix was something nobody expected. The developer note on this crane change says this: the BMS Class 2 mobile autocrane and the BMS Overseer Skyhauler can no longer be entered by enemies. This is intended to address scout planes being used as an easy method to bypass AI defenses to get into enemy cranes in backline regions to lift up packaged assets so AI can destroy the crane and the costly packaged asset. With the introduction of cheap scout planes, players were flying these scouts into backline facilities, looking for high-value items like airframes, and then jumping into the cranes that were being used to store or move them. By entering these cranes, the base's defenses would then consider that vehicle to be an enemy vehicle. They would immediately shoot at the crane, and once this crane was destroyed, the packaged material that they had would be destroyed too. You could essentially trade a scout plane, which cost maybe an hour of your time to make, for, let's say, a heavy bomber airframe, which could take days of material processing and production. The irony of the situation, though, is that aircraft are the only large facility-locked vehicles that can be stored in structures, aircraft depots. So any players who had lost their aircraft to enemy sabotage operations were simply seen as being lazy. They thought that they were safe in their backline base with no defenses, they would leave their high-value items out, and unsurprisingly, they would end up losing them. The funny thing is, though, scout planes also restrict players from carrying anything in their inventory, meaning that anything that was stolen in these facilities on a crane means that that crane was unlocked to begin with. Losing these airframes could be seen as a tough lesson to learn that nowhere is safe in-game. And honestly, this problem could have just been prevented by pressing L to lock a vehicle on your keyboard. After this update, many players in Foxhole see this change to cranes as an overly heavy-handed way at solving a problem that really shouldn't even be a problem in the first place. They think that sabotage and partisans aren't the real issue, and instead of fixing glaring gameplay problems, the devs push through an easier fix that now has huge unintended knock-on effects for every aspect of the game. We already mentioned vehicle storage. If vehicles made at facilities could simply be stored in a player-made hangar, then these cranes would have never been a problem in the first place. But we also have a new problem. The extremely expensive airframes introduced in this latest update are considered large shippable items. Unlike a regular shippable, like a container or an artillery piece, large shippables cannot be moved on flatbeds. This means that the only real way to move the planes that you make is by loading them up on trains and shipping them to the airfield. Trains themselves are also very expensive, and loading and unloading them is a very time-consuming process. Many players either don't have the time or the resources to move these airframes the moment they are finished, and instead, they wait until they want to use them to move them to the airfield. It's easy to point and laugh at a facility player who had their airframe stolen. It's easy to say you should have locked it or you should have added some more defenses. But the reality of the situation is that moving these things is far more time consuming than they really should be. Many players point to the very obvious solution. Airframes should be small shippables, or at least the fighter planes should be small shippables. This would almost immediately reduce the amount of high-value items laying around facilities waiting for transport. But not only that, there's also another obvious solution that would still work with the developer's idea of protecting facility equipment without absolutely kneecapping both frontline and partisan players. Simply prevent players from using the Overseer crane. This crane is not anything like the typical mobile crane. The Overseer is an extremely expensive facility-made crane that requires its own rail system and power to use. Technically, it is a vehicle, but you never see these things on the front line. It actually acts more like a building since it requires power, and every other facility building in the game is actually faction locked. As a warden, I couldn't just walk into a colonial facility and begin using those same buildings for myself. We would have to completely destroy this entire place and build everything up from scratch if we wanted to start production. This is the same restriction that's placed on other cranes on buildings like refineries, seaports, storage depots, or mass production factories. But not only that, we also already have a faction-locked facility crane in the game, the BMS Foreman Stacker. You cannot use this crane if you are an enemy player, since it is a facility building. So why not just make this other giant facility crane work just like this? There are many solutions to the problem of losing your expensive packaged equipment on a crane in your backline facility. That does not include removing players' ability to simply use cranes. So that's why, right in the middle of Foxhole's deadliest war, both Wardens and Colonials stopped fighting to send the developers a message. Give us back our cranes! This might seem like a silly protest, but these little mobile cranes are unironically the backbone of so much that goes on in Foxhole, and restricting them to the enemy will have very frustrating knock-on effects that will see less in-place weapons on the front lines and more wasted material being used to destroy enemy cranes that are simply blocking areas. Partisan tap ops that have shaped wars will now be non-existent, and even simple flanks around enemy front lines will be far more difficult. Players already use vehicles and containers to create blockades, and although the Great Crane Wall of Foxcatcher was done primarily as a joke, I wouldn't be surprised if we see large-scale use of cranes used to prevent players from sneaking around defenses and closing large gaps. These vehicles are incredibly hard to destroy with simple infantry weapons, and since they are so cheap, dedicated players could send dozens of them out to create walls of their own. Foxhole is a sandbox, but with this latest change to the game, it really feels like that sandbox is getting ever so smaller. But what do you guys think? Are you on Team Crane, or do you think that these are good changes? Let me know down in the comments below, and if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. But that's it for me. Until next time, peace.